Hi, I am Joseph Stark, and I will be presenting on the life and major works of the composer Antonio Vivaldi. So, to begin, we need to establish a little bit of the background information surrounding Vivaldi. First, and arguably most importantly, considering the shift in music depending on the time period, Antonio Vivaldi lived from 1678 to 1741. With that, Vivaldi published the most of his works and was therefore the most prominent in 1720. That was around the time that he was at peak popularity in going in towards the later 1720s as well. During that, he was considered to be a Baroque artist due to the time period. Going farther, his most prominent work was The Four Seasons, a set of violin concertos composed in the early 1720s and published sometime around 1725, but we'll be getting into that a little bit more in depth later on. So, going into his childhood, there's not a whole lot that's known about Vivaldi. We do know that his baptism was performed by a midwife immediately following his birth. This was due to his family being really stringent Catholics in Italy at the time, where there was an earthquake the day he was born or some bad omen that led to a belief that he had to be immediately baptized to cleanse him of original sin and save his soul. Now, beyond that, the only other real interesting fact about Vivaldi's childhood is that he learned to play violin from his father, Giovanni Battista. Now, with his background established, let's move on to his professional life. So, Vivaldi's first real major music-oriented job was as the master of violin at the orphanage Pio Ospedale della Pietà, otherwise known as the Devout Hospital of Mercy, which I should have read the first time instead of trying to pronounce it in Italian. This hospital was in Venice, and he was 25 years old at the time of achieving this position. While he worked there, he composed very many pieces and really went above and beyond what the job title suggested he needed to do. He brought a whole lot of attention to the orphanage for their choir and orchestra, which previously really wasn't all that hyped up. It wasn't very prominent, especially for that region, where other hospitals, other orphanages had similar things going on that were just better at the time. Vivaldi really turned that around at the Devout Hospital of Mercy and made it one of the most prominent ones in the region. Now, during this, he really didn't see eye to eye fully with the directors of the hospital. In fact, he took a year sabbatical where he was essentially deciding if he wanted to go back, do different work, or what exactly he wanted to do with his life because the directors refused to give him a pay raise. Now, with that, after that year stint, he was then promoted to music director in 1716, which was a substantial step up for him, and showed that his work was beginning to be recognized and that people were starting to see that it was because of Vivaldi that this orphanage choir was starting to do really well, that he was bringing new ideas to the table and just bringing in a fresh light. Now, continuing into Vivaldi's professional life, he composed opera as well as his official work. Notably, he wrote the Arcelia Regia di Ponte, which I shouldn't have even attempted to pronounce. And it was really notable because the first year when he tried to perform it, it was blocked by the censors due to depicting a lesbian relationship. At the time, it was very taboo to speak of something like that, and even more so to perform it on a stage for a massive audience. So you can imagine why the censors blocked it. However, somehow the next year he got it through the censors, and it was an absolutely massive success that no one was expecting. The piece performed very well. It was received, in terms of Vivaldi, very well by critics and average people alike. And it was one of the major turning points for Vivaldi in showing what sort of work he could do. Now, as you might be able to tell from him writing the opera about a lesbian couple, his work was very progressive for the time, but not only in subject matter, but also in how it was performed. It could be argued that he was almost the beginnings of avant-garde. In fact, he was so progressive that many other musicians had pamphlets published about him denouncing him and his work, where they would legitimately pay publishers to write negative articles on him, and then they would spread it to the general public to try to get venues to stop hosting him and people to stop sponsoring him. However, this presentation isn't through, so we can see that those pamphlets really didn't have that much of an effect on him. In fact, in 1718, he began working as the Maestro di Capella for Prince Philip of Hesse-Darmstadt. He was the governor of Mantua. Now with that, it showed that Vivaldi was able to find a real, genuine sponsor, someone who appreciated his work, was wealthy and had the influence to afford to support him, and wanted to do so. It was a real turning point for Vivaldi, as he was able to suddenly be more free and be more experimental and even more avant-garde in his work. This is really one of the major things in Vivaldi's life that made him a major contributor to the field of music. Now, during his time there, he wrote the Four Seasons, which is arguably his largest work. It was 4 violin concertos representative of the 4 seasons, and of these, spring was the only one that even borrowed any motifs from other work. Everything else was wholly original. And with the 4 seasons, it's important to go into what exactly made it unique to the field of music. So with this, Vivaldi was giving a musical expression to each season of the year. It was published in 1725 in Amsterdam with 8 additional violin concertos. Overall, it was a pretty big release. Now with this, the 4 Seasons became the best known of Vivaldi's work, which, because unusually for the time, Vivaldi published the concerti with accompanying poems that he likely wrote himself, but we don't know that for sure. Now, these poems were Vivaldi sort of giving his perspective on what the seasons meant and how we can relay that to how he performed the music. And going into that, it's sort of, the poems were meant to guide how we were supposed to interpret the different musical themes, the different motifs, all of the different aspects of music that we've been talking about in class this semester. Now, doing that by including the concerti in the poems, it is one of the earliest and most detailed examples of what's considered a program of music, something that's pretty commonplace nowadays, but at the time it really wasn't. It showed the innovation and progressive ideas that Vivaldi took and really ran with during his lifetime. Now, going into what exactly the music was like, Spring Vivaldi constructed to be a faster-paced piece of music, where it started out allegro, then moved on to slow down a bit, and then sped up back towards the end. It was something pretty common for the time, and that really draws upon how it was borrowing motifs from other work. However, Vivaldi was very persistent in making his work unique, and that's why moving on to Summer, it was composed for G minor. It started out allegro, then moves on to adagio, and then ends up at presto, which, really looking at it nowadays, that's not an insane leap to make. But again, looking at 1725 musical standards, those shifts from adagio to presto were something that really not many pieces incorporated, and something that set the progressive ideas of someone like Vivaldi apart from the rest. Going into Autumn, he starts out Allegro, it's performed in F minor, then he goes into Adagio and then back to Allegro. It's really similar to Spring, which, thinking about it and how Vivaldi wrote the poems to sort of incorporate the emotions that should be tied to the pieces, it shows that Spring and Autumn should be similar, so they follow the same general structure. Now, the final one in the piece was Winter, also composed for F minor, started at Allegro, moved to Largo, which is a relatively slow pace, and then went back to Allegro. Again, it's something that jumps around a little bit, it's unique for the time, and just something that was generally pretty interesting. The major takeaway from the Four Seasons was the fact that it showed that Vivaldi was really willing to do new things for the time. I mean, he set the standard for what a program of music is, where there is the actual musical pieces, along with the text that's meant to go along and sort of guide the emotions that go along with it. Where it's no longer just you hear a piece and you try to interpret it for yourself, but rather you hear a piece, you think about your initial interpretation, and then you're able to look at the other works that the composer provided and sort of guide yourself towards the suggested way of thinking, where it still leaves some freedom. Now, shortly after releasing the Four Seasons, Vivaldi was invited to play for the Pope in 1725. Remember when I mentioned the unique circumstance about his baptism? He was a very devout Catholic. This was something major for Vivaldi, and something that he really took to heart. It was something that meant a lot for him to be able to do. Now, with that addressed, let's move on to the later life of Antonio Vivaldi. Well, despite a roaring success, the interest in Vivaldi's music waned over time, meaning that, much like any musician, listening to them on repeat just isn't going to do it forever. The general public really liked Vivaldi's early work and stuck with it, but Vivaldi's problem came with his form of progressivism was really repeating the same type of progressivism over and over again, and that just sort of got tiring to audiences over time. However, he did have one major fan that was still very influential, and that was Emperor Charles VI. Quite an impressive fan to have. And seeing that Vivaldi was falling on hard times and still enjoying his music personally, Emperor Charles offered him a position in his court. This was a massive offer, something that people would really fight over. It was a massive position and a massive award that Vivaldi was very excited to take. He packed his stuff and was ready to move to Vienna very soon after receiving the offer. Now, once he arrived in Vienna, Emperor Charles VI died pretty soon as Vivaldi arrived. This was really the last note in Vivaldi's Song of Life. It left Vivaldi without a job or any sort of stable source of income. He was essentially destitute. He became impoverished and died poor in 1741, really with no friends, no family, and to the best of anyone's knowledge, buried in a pauper's grave. Vivaldi really is representative of something where he rose from the middle class, became one of the best known names in music, the public lost interest in him, and his last hope was struck away. With that, it shows that even though Vivaldi was lost to time for quite a while, in fact, Many of his pieces are still being resurfaced and found today, and being enjoyed by people in the modern time. Vivaldi is an interesting case study where there were certainly articles written about him, whether they were positive or negative. He was very well known, but much of his work was lost. Vivaldi is interesting because he was prominent, then he wasn't, and now he somehow is again, and we're struggling to find all of his pieces. Because he was a pretty prolific composer, but whenever he died destitute and pauper, many people just didn't keep their original compositions, their programs from him, or anything related to that. It was old news, and they treated it as such. That sort of wraps up the story of Vivaldi. Here are all the sources I used, and overall, Vivaldi is a pretty interesting study.